Hello, dear listeners, and welcome to the Walk for Wildlife podcast. This time it's an English version for all of our international listeners, so they also get to enjoy this talk. And unfortunately, we're not in the lush surroundings of the forest today, but we're in the indoor nature garden on the Wageningen campus, which is actually not too bad because it's raining outside. So maybe you can catch a glimpse of that in the background noise of this podcast and enjoy it a little bit. And today I have the very great pleasure of interviewing the nature philosopher, plant ecologist and writer Matthijs Schouten. So welcome Matthijs, and it is an honor to have you here.
I'm happy to be here.
Thank you very much. And during our Walk for Wildlife walk, we had this slogan, where there is a will, there is a way for nature. And how do you think that applies in the Netherlands, actually at this moment?
You mean when you ask in the Netherlands that because we're so overcrowded and nature is so under pressure, is that the reason that you ask it for the Netherlands specifically, or is it worldwide?
Well, it's a worldwide, but also because the focus of our walk was to look at our Dutch nature and our Dutch wildlife, and because people rarely focus on how animals perceive our Dutch nature network and whether it should be improved. There's a lot of rules and bureaucracy around it, but if there is a will, there is a way. And is there a will at this moment?
2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I would have said, no, there's no will. I'm changing my view. Because, you know, this whole nitrogen problem that we had in the last weeks, you all know that for it's, I think now 3 consecutive governments, we had rather right-wing governments. And what I myself find almost impossible to explain to my foreign colleagues is that 20 years ago, the Netherlands were leading in Europe in terms of nature conservation, environmental conservation. The whole concept of the Habitat Directive Natura 2000, that concept of connecting nature reserves through corridors, etc., the Natura 2000 network, was basically cooked up in the Netherlands because that was part of our national nature conservation strategy that we formulated in 1990. And that had that concept of an ecological framework, of an ecologische hoofdstructuur, which was then taken over by Brussels. We were leading, absolutely leading. And whenever I was traveling and giving talks on nature conservation and environmental conservation, everyone was saying, the Netherlands is so fantastic and a densely populated country and they still maintain biodiversity and do this, that and the other. And then that changed in 15 years. And last year, every year it is sort of recorded how the member states in the Union perform in terms of nature and environmental conservation. Last year we were one but last. Malta was behind us, and we said, see, we're not the worst pupil in the class. But this year we found out that not all data in Malta were in yet. Now they're in, we are last. Within 15 years we shifted from the first place to the last place. So there was not very much will in the Netherlands for quite a long period of time with policymakers and politicians. That suddenly, interestingly enough, is now rapidly changing. You remember that there's this problem with the PAS, the programmatische aanpak stikstof. It's basically about what our nitrogen deposition in this country is too high, also according to all kinds of international standards, and our nature reserves are suffering. And then one of the previous governments decided to make a deal with Brussels, and we could then emit more nitrogen than basically was permissible, provided that within the nature reserves we took measures to counteract. That's called PAS. So we happily went on with everything we did, and in the nature reserves very little happened. And then there were some NGOs who went to court and said, now the Dutch government is in breach with all kinds of agreements, and that stopped 18,000 development projects in the Netherlands in one go. Now that gave an interesting situation. I was quite worried because I thought this is not helping environmental conservation, because the whole country will be against us if you cannot build houses anymore, etc., etc. But it's only a couple of days ago that a report was presented on behalf of the government by experts who studied this whole issue. And there, a right-wing politician stated nature goes first, should have primate. And not everything will be possible anymore in this country. nature should be conserved and nature should be restored. So suddenly there appears to be a little bit more of a will.
Yeah, that sounds like a little bit of a more hope.
Yes, and suddenly I became a little bit optimistic again. Yes.
Yeah, that's interesting.
But I always have believed that where there's a will, there is a way.
Mm-hmm. Although it started, it sounds like it was a little bit of a forced will by the courts, but luckily now it's beginning to turn into a will.
What I found quite fascinating in this whole discourse, because it's a discourse that immediately hit all the media as well, of course, that the people that are really protesting against this advice are farmers and the ultra-right-wing parties. And the ultra-right-wing parties are, I cannot say that we can ignore them, because one of them is quite big, but that's they don't believe in climate change anyway, so they're a rather strange image of the world. But apart from farmers and the ultra-right-wing parties, and the building corporations, and of course some commercial organizations, most of the political spectrum, and also what I hear in the media, a big part of society feels, listen, we have very little nature left, and what is there should remain. So suddenly it turns out more positively than I'd ever thought. So I'm at the moment cautiously optimistic about this country.
Well, that's good to hear. So it sounds like a little group is, throwing, what do you call it, a bad taste in the
exactly.
But overall, it's more positive than it seems. And you spoke a little bit about the worldview of these right-wing people or the farmers, and you yourself are actually quite an expert on different cultural expressions perceptions towards nature and different worldviews. And how do you think, in our case, in the Western culture, does it influence our perception of nature?
Something is changing rather dramatically in Western civilization, and I find this absolutely mesmerizing. Since the Greek classical period, and then throughout Christianity, we felt in the Western world nature was there for us. See, in the Greek classical period, and the Roman classical period, there were various philosophers who claimed that nature was made for humans, that gods designed nature for human use, which was taken on by Christianity, and Christianity always sort of claimed that this comes from the Bible. This is not in the Bible at all. It's a Greek, Hellenistic, Roman view that was sort of projected on biblical theology. But the Christians took on this image of a nature designed for humans and simply stated, God created nature for human use. There was even a great scientist in the 17th century who said God created cattle to keep beef fresh for human consumption, this image. And that has been with us for, let's say, almost 2,000 years. And that was, when I was a young boy and grew up, that was what I learned in school, in primary school. I remember that the teacher put out a map of the Netherlands, and it was all green and blue and yellow, and there were a few purple blotches, and he said, these are the last wild grounds in the Netherlands, but we're going to develop them very soon, and it will all be done by the end of the century. This idea that nature was there for us to cultivate and use, it was very standard. And within 1 or 2 generations, this is now rapidly changing. I've conducted a lot of research into perceptions of nature in different cultural contexts. And what we see in the Netherlands, but also in other European member states, we also see it happening in the States now, is that more and more people feel that we humans are part of nature, part of a bigger, ecological system called the Earth, and that we should take care of it. This idea that it all is there for us to use and abuse or whatever, that is changing. So that's fascinating. At the same time, the conduct is not changing.
The implementation.
The implementation. That lags behind. More and more people feel that they should treat the world differently, but find it difficult to do so. And I was just teaching a class, and we were asking this question: why is it so difficult to become more ecocentric? While you feel more ecocentric, because the previous view was, as we say in environmental philosophy, anthropocentric, human-central. We now take the whole system more central. When you feel this or see this and position you in that way, why is it so difficult to live accordingly? There's various reasons. First of all, it's more expensive. If you have to buy sustainable products, the shops for the sustainable products are always further away than the nearest supermarket. very often you don't even know what is more sustainable, not so sustainable. And then we all have our conditionings. When you're used to doing things in certain ways, it's very difficult to change. No. So it is not easy to implement a more sustainable lifestyle. But I also think we have to give it time. We don't have much time left, in the sense that we need to change quite rapidly. Yeah. But I feel that compared to what I saw 5 to 10 years ago, things are already changing. Also in conduct and behavior.
Yeah, that's, it's good to hear that the perception is changing towards a more positive thing, but that the implementation is a bit more difficult. But what do you think we can of course always learn from others.
Yeah.
And other cultures have other worldviews. Are there any things we can learn from other cultures or worldviews to make this implementation perhaps
easier, yeah. I was at, you know what Springtij is? Springtij is a 3-day festival of the Schelling, a sustainability festival, and everybody that matters is there, and I was there for the first time, by the way, so I don't matter very much, but I was there to represent nature, because all the Springtij is there now for 10 years, I think, and it was virtually all about sustainability, circular economy, circular agriculture, all that sort of stuff. But I felt now that nature should also be represented. I was there and I was listening for days to all kinds of speeches, and I was amazed by how many of these people there were rather anthropocentric. Yeah. Talking about, because people were asked, why are you here? And people said, because I want to continue enjoying nature, or for my grandchildren, or whatever. I didn't hear anyone say, except a few, I'm here for nature. So I had this talk at the end, so the talk, by the way, these were the people that were talking this way were largely elderly, grey gentlemen.
So they come from
from a different world. And I saw that a number of younger people did not agree at all. So the talk that I gave at the end is, if we really want to make a change rapidly, we need to change our perception of the human-nature relationship. And the first thing that we need to do is to look at nature not as a thing, but as a being. The week before I was in Ireland, walking with an old farmer, his farm, and it was a farm in a beautiful area, semi-natural and lots of rocks and grasslands, and a lovely gentleman. At a certain moment he stopped, and this is in the karst landscape, but there were fantastic rocks. And then he said, don't the rocks display themselves beautifully today? And I was so touched, because what we would say, isn't that beautiful? Or I love rocks. Yeah. No, he said, don't the rocks display themselves beautifully today?
So talking from the rocks.
For them, they were entities, not just things lying there that were beautiful, not beautiful. He saw them as something that a famous philosopher, Martin Buber, called a thou, someone else, a du, or a jij, or and I think that's crucial, that we move from that Western perception where we've taken all soul and all mind out of nature and made it a sort of thing that we study scientifically and how it works and moves and etc., to something that is alive.
To give it its own...
To give it its own subjectivity. Because the sad thing is, you know, in our legal framework, we can only give rights to an entity that has will and is capable to act. And we have always assumed that nature has no will, no capacity to act, and is therefore has no subject, and therefore there was never any rights for nature. It became a domain of no law, which means that we've colonized it physically, made it our home, we built all over nature, we physically took it.
Yeah, because it couldn't say anything back.
It couldn't say anything back. We colonized it instrumentally, we made it our storehouse of goods and services or whatever. And we colonized it mentally. What we also did is that we project all our images and ideas and feelings and concepts and ideas of beauty in nature. We never ask her what she wants.
But that is changing.
That is changing. And that is, and there I see a fascinating movement, because there's a young group of artists in the Netherlands that call themselves the Parliament of Things. I don't know whether you know them. Oh, no. And they follow the French philosopher Bruno Latour, who says that if we want to move to a sustainable future, we should extend the democratic system in such a way that non-human entities also have a voice.
Also a part of
and then there's, of course, the question who then represents nature, and that's an interesting question. But this group of people followed this philosophy, and they set up last year the embassy of the North Sea. And there you're trained to talk on behalf of the cod, or behalf of the water, or on behalf of seaweeds. And just that effort of trying to place yourself in let's say, the reality of a non-human entity changes your position. And I find that quite crucial if we want to move sustainability, that we don't see us surrounded here by things, but by plants and living beings that have also a certain right to be there.
That's funny. You mentioned about the who should represent this nature, because what comes to my mind immediately is kids. That kids are always very good representatives of the outside, I think, because they immediately feel usually more
connected.
Connected to it outside, and they also, if you think of children's stories, for example, they usually have a lot to do with outside and animal perspectives and from animal lives. So maybe the next question would be funny for a normal adult to ask, but from what you've said, it's still very important to ask, is how do you think nature in the Netherlands then would be defined from an animal perspective, if you look at it through animals?
I would say, if from the animal perspective, I would say utter colonization. See, what we did when the West moved to the States, when the colonists, the Mayflower, moved over and took over what later was to become the United States of America, there were some people living there. We called them Native Americans. No, they were fully colonized, and they were then given some reserves where they could do their own thing, provided that there's nothing of value in that reserve, because otherwise we move in and move them out. That's what we've always done. We've done exactly the same with nature. If I were an animal in the Netherlands, I would feel rather colonized. Like, as a wild animal, I can survive somewhere in a reserve, but then I have to be managed as well a little bit. And as a certain animal, I'm not allowed. The wolf is not really allowed in, and other animals are treated not so very well. What I'm trying to say is, I would feel as a colonized entity that has no rights. So, and
that doesn't sound all too.
And I'm quite sure that a child would not feel that. Here's a brilliant student of mine, Reineke. And Reineke is conducting research in the perceptions of nature with children. And some of what she finds, I'm not very happy with, because it's rather anthropocentric and not very connected. But at the same time, I think that's also part of the surroundings with in which a child grows up. I've no doubt that the first experiences that a child has without all kinds of messages from its surrounding will always be a sense of wonder, because you're always mesmerized with something that you don't know yet. And you try to investigate and try to see. But then when people start to tell you, that's that and that and that, you should probably, then it changes. Yeah, exactly. The sense of wonder goes out of it. Yeah.
So unfortunately, we are not children anymore, and
aren't we?
Sometimes
there you make a mistake. That's the biggest mistake you can make. Of course, we're also still children. If we lose the playfulness in life, then all is lost. No. Let's keep that part of being surprised, a sense of wonder, instead of feeling now I'm grown up and now I know everything. You understand what I'm trying to say?
I understand. Yeah, you exactly ran in front of my question.
Okay,
so,
right. All right.
Well, no, that's perfect, because I wanted to ask if you had advice for, young students, our generation, for the future. But that sounds like a perfect advice to.
I have a few. One advice, and I gave that advice also on Terschelling. One advice is listen to your own narrative. What I heard on Terschelling, almost in every session, we should use the forests more for carbon sequestration. We moeten de bossen meer inzetten voor de CO2 vasthouden. We moeten de bossen inzetten. Instead of, maybe the forest can help us. You see, that's a different narrative.
It's a very different
and when you
framing.
use that first narrative, that's a narrative a child hears. So investigate your own narratives. That's one thing. And be able to say, doesn't that purple flower there display itself wonderfully? You get my drift? Yes. That's one thing. The other thing, I think, what would be very helpful if we would use, even if it's only 5 minutes a day, but do it every day, to look at something that's not man-made. It can be a tree, a shrub, a piece of earth, water, an animal. And look at it without any concept, without any idea, without any expectation, without any interpretation, without any name, without whatever functionality. Just watch. And in that watching, you make a simple connection. Something can then reveal itself. Like, don't the stones reveal themselves beautiful? You get my drift? Because we immediately colonize all these things out there with our ideas, our images, our expectations, our names, particularly scientists. I mean, I look at that shrub and immediately have a name, etc., etc. Try to do that for 5 minutes a day. Don't do that. And then
that's wonderful.
Something else will show itself. And then I also feel that we should, in the Netherlands, have places in various parts of the country where we humans do not go. That we simply leave to nature. That's nature's domain. In a true partnership, you leave nature also its own space. It doesn't need to be half the Netherlands, but areas where even the scientists don't go in anymore. It's for nature itself. And lastly, let's celebrate nature more. We talk about nature a lot in terms of biodiversity loss and gloom and doom, and people don't want to hear that anymore. I mean, when you hear that again the forests are burning, and again people get upset, and then they close off. Let's also celebrate nature. There's a Fête à la Nature. We have it once a year, last weekend of May. Let's all celebrate that it's there, and that we're part of it, and that we are in interaction with it, and that gives you a sense of hope and connectedness. So that's what I would advise.
Yeah, thank you very much for these extremely positive advices.
Okay.
Also some advices I've never heard before, so I'll try and spread them around and keep everyone optimistic about our future. And lastly, I want to thank you for your wonderful answers, and thank you for joining us for the
You're
Wildlife.
very welcome. And I hope that at least 10 people will listen.
I'm sure we'll make sure.
Okay.
Yeah, this was the Walk for Wildlife podcast. See you at the next one.